So as Avalon said, I'm Kristi Lieske, and I'm the ocean planner for Delaware's Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. Thank you for being here for this session. I know after lunch, it's kind of like a sleepy time. You could feel a little tired and a little bit worn out, so we're going to push through, and this is going to be a very lively session, I think. We've got some great people here to talk about something that's really important and maybe occasionally gets overlooked when we talk about the regional ocean economy. So we all know that the ocean provides so much for the economy throughout the mid-Atlantic, and you think about those like really hard hitters like commercial shipping and tourism are some of the big ones, and commercial fishing is also big, and we sometimes miss some of those smaller industries or smaller sectors. So we really wanted to highlight this. As Avalon said, it's become sort of an emerging issue here. It's something that we're all getting really interested in as demand for space off our coast is escalating faster than ever in multiple ways. And one of those can be aquaculture, and a lot of our aquaculture is happening in inland and more in bays and protected spaces. But sometimes it's coming offshore, potentially. So we wanted to talk about how shellfish are important to the economy, not only aquaculture, but to the recreationalists that are doing this recreationally, and talking about how it's not just an economic driver in the sense that we all think about a lot, which is, where people are spending money and people are using resources for this. But it's also about the well-being that is provided to the people who rely on seafood, particularly shellfish, for their food, and the feeling you get when you're out shellfishing, clamming. You're just standing in the water, raking your toes through the sand or the muck. So it's more than just this, very tangible economic outlook. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So I wanted to introduce the speakers that we have for you today. And we are going to first hear from Kevin. Kevin Madley is an aquaculture coordinator for the Greater Atlantic region of the NOAA Fisheries Service, based in Gloucester. I don't know how to say that, Massachusetts. I'm sorry. Wow, I totally butchered that.
You're not the first.
I'm sure I'm not, but I should have probably looked that up and did a YouTube video. Gosh. Anyways, Kevin works with federal and state agencies, industry, and members of the scientific, academic, and NGO communities on a variety of marine aquaculture issues, with over 17 years of federal policy and regulatory experience. And then we are going to hear from Taky. Taky Tahmid is a PhD candidate in environmental economics at the University of Delaware and a graduate research assistant at the School of Marine Science and Policy. His research focuses on the impacts of climate change on GDP, food security, labor outcomes, and fisheries, and environmental valuation. And next up, we will have a presentation from Ellen Rowe. She currently works with the Molluscan Ecology Lab at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, where she developed the Virginia Oyster Stock Assessment and Replenishment Archive, or VOSARA. VOSARA? I don't know. She'll tell you. VOSARA 2.0. She graduated from William and Mary in May 2025, where she studied biology and marine science and began working on VOSARA 2.0. She is passionate about using GIS to transform data into engaging products that bring science to a broader audience. And last but not least, we will hear from Dr. Daphne Munroe. She is an associate professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Science at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on shellfish larval ecology and large-scale physical and biological drivers of population dynamics and climate adaptation in shellfish populations. Recently, she's become involved in research related to development of offshore wind power and its interaction with commercial fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And these illustrious panelists here have more under their belt that I haven't even mentioned, so please do read the full speaker bio and speak to them if you'd like to about more of their work. So we are going to hear from each of them. They each have a presentation to give to you, and then we will have time for audience questions after that. So please do think about your questions during the presentations and hold those till the end. There will be ample time for those questions at the end. So I will then now turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Kristi. Thank you. Marco, for bringing us together. It's nice to speak to a group with diverse perspectives. I speak a lot to the aquaculture industry, and so a lot of times we hear each other saying the same thing, and I get excited when I get to speak to a group with these diverse perspectives and an entity like this, which is so focused on collaboration amongst groups. So I'm going to start with a little presentation and start at a global and national level, walk it down a little bit into more of a regional level, and then we're going to have some really focused regional presentations to follow me. So hopefully that'll give you a good perspective of how this all fits. So the big picture is that the United States is a seafood importer. We have a running annual deficit that's currently around $20 billion annually in seafood. Most of that seafood that is imported is, so we import 75 to 90% of the seafood consumed in the United States. Most of that seafood is aquaculture product. It's just farmed elsewhere and then imported in. A lot of people, you know, that's a light bulb moment for a lot of people. They don't understand the numbers are that big for aquaculture consumed seafood in the United States. So I wanted to make time to start there. And then you say, well, where is all of this seafood coming from that's being farmed elsewhere? This will give you some perspective. These charts are from the United Nations. The red color is red is inland aquaculture production. The salmon or pink color is marine aquaculture production. And then the blues are wild harvest or capture fisheries. So within a region, those are all stacked up. You can see the top two on your left is China. Next to that on the right is the rest of Asia, excluding China. So those top two represent Asian production. And you see there's a lot of aquaculture production happening there. And the trend is it's increasing and going to continue to increase there. They're not slowing down. So you can see North America, or I think it's North America labeled the third on the left column, third one down. Somewhat of a stable trend more recently. It is worth noting in the text to the right that for the first time, global aquaculture production did surpass capture fisheries in 2022. So that's been a trend it's been approaching that for a number of years. 2022, you know, we got to a 51% versus 49% aquaculture versus capture fisheries, and that trend is expected to keep increasing. Meaning, we're not gonna capture more wild harvest fish. Is not what's expected, but we will, as a global community, grow and farm more seafood. So that's the expectation. The trends are supporting that, and the United Nations tracks it. So you can keep track of it now through their documentation. Another way of looking at it is, so this graph, I do want to point out that this is inland production and marine production. So this is not just marine seafood production, but it's inland and marine. Important to point that out. But it shows you rather drastically where some of the big aquaculture production is happening. I also want to point out that, when I started tracking this data, say 10 years ago, the United States was somewhere around 13th. Now we're at 20th on that list. And it's not that we're decreasing our seafood production. It's just that other countries are bypassing us in seafood farming. And some of those you can see just to the left of us: Iran, Turkey, Malaysia, North Korea. So we are heading the wrong way on the graph, many would say. And then, so moving more from the global perspective to, actually, I do want to go back. I remember what I was going to say about this. The other thing I want to point out here is you must also realize, to get the full context, is that the United States has one of the largest EEZs, exclusive economic zones, on the planet. And yet, we're not in the top producers, even though this does include inland fisheries. So there, as much as maybe those first few slides were frustrating, or I want to offer the fact that there's a lot of optimism and hope, because we have the capacity and the potential to farm more of our own seafood, because we do have such a large exclusive economic zone. And then kind of focusing on the bottom right, you'll see for marine aquaculture species, oyster is king, pretty much around the country, followed by clams. Atlantic salmon is produced in state waters of Maine currently. And then the text on the left shows that all of this production is happening in state waters. So that 0 to 3, generally, it's 0 to 3 nautical miles, is producing the seafood that we are farming currently. We have 0 production in federal waters, meaning beyond the 3 nautical miles currently. Now, that's not the case around the globe. Other countries are farming and pushing the boundaries and developing technologies to farm, in offshore environments. We are not doing that in the United States yet. Although you will see that it says 4, I think now it's maybe 5 commercial projects, applications in federal waters currently. So there is, in the last 10 years, definitely more interest. There are more stakeholders knocking on the doors of federal agencies saying, hey, how could we do this in the United States? And so there are more ideas, more proponents, more applicants, but 0 production in federal waters currently. Looking regionally, again, this just gives you some perspective of where we're at in the region. The Atlantic coast does produce 46% of value for shellfish, marine shellfish. Gulf of America produces maybe higher volume, but higher value produced here on the Atlantic coast. And then looking within that shellfish production within the United States, you'll see this broken down by region. The top graph is meat weight pounds per region. The bottom graph is shellfish value in dollars. But either way, again, oyster is king in both of those categories, followed by clams and then mussels. You will notice that mussels, 0 production in the southeastern Gulf of America. Mussels is an example of a cold water species. So there is some reason why some of these regions have higher production. It's due to the fact that culture species have been, some of the species that have the high markets or the market demand are cold water species. So there's just not as much production in warmer regions. That's not to say that there's not other species that can be cultured and have been and will be cultured in warmer regions, but there has been kind of a preponderance of cold water species aquaculture to date. So I set that scenario up where we are globally, where we are nationally and regionally. Now let's talk about some opportunities and who I am and why I'm here talking to you. So I'm a regional aquaculture coordinator for NOAA Fisheries. You see me there in the upper right because I represent the region Massachusetts down through North Carolina, including the Great Lakes, one of that network of regional aquaculture coordinators in NOAA Fisheries that works with our headquarters office in NOAA Fisheries. So the NOAA Aquaculture Program largely exists across 3 line offices you see here. So in addition to NOAA Fisheries, it's National Ocean Service and OAR, which houses the Sea Grant Program. You see the different capacities and tasks that we get involved with on the right, from regulatory and policy coordination, science products and advice for natural resource communities, extension services, and then, as I mentioned, grants and financial assistance. So I do want to mention that while there was that economic story that the United States is falling behind as far as global aquaculture production, that has caught the attention of all levels of federal government, and we're starting to see impacts from that, and that's part of the optimism and the hope is that, and it ties to some of the things we heard earlier, which I think we'll talk about later, which is opportunity, and it's one of the things I want to make sure we bring out today. So these are just 2 examples of what we're seeing from the highest levels of federal government having impacts. 2 executive orders, the first one from 2020, the second one 2025, both focused on seafood competitiveness. So these were not aquaculture specific, but they both contain aquaculture specific components, saying agencies go forth and do this to support aquaculture production and in the larger seafood production community. So the executive order from 2020, those tasks on the left have pretty much all been completed. I'm not going to talk about them, but I want you to be aware you can go find those tools, and you can also reach out to me if you have trouble finding them, because they can be resources for your networks. Many of the things on the right are somewhat new from 2025 and are in process. As far as federal permitting, many of you are familiar with permitting for shellfish production or aquaculture production in state waters. So this is focusing on what if you're outside of state waters and there's not a state leasing program, there's not a state coordinator to guide you through it. You're pretty much going to work with these federal agencies. Every project is going to need an Army Corps of Engineers permit because you're putting gear in navigable waters, unless you're not putting gear in navigable waters, and we could talk about that. But and then if you have a discharge from your operation, you would need a permit from the EPA. Depending on the species you're choosing, you may need some permit from NOAA. Oftentimes you do not. For example, oysters, blue mussels, those are not species that are managed, or seaweeds. They're not managed under the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act as like a fisheries management plan. So we don't provide a permit for those. You could just work with the Army Corps, get your permit, and we will be involved through our other consultation duties, but we would not permit that activity. So, I will pause to say, many of you are familiar with working on offshore wind, maybe scarred, but familiar. There is no leasing program. There's no leasing authority that's been granted by Congress to any federal agency in the United States for leasing for aquaculture in federal waters. So there is no leasing. It's only, you need permits and you can go operate. That being said, I had a few questions coming into today's presentation about a proposed project off of Rhode Island. So I want to give an example. This can happen in a few ways. This is a proponent who came to federal agency and said, we want to farm mussels in federal waters, meaning outside of state waters, south of Rhode Island. How do we do that? They don't have a discharge, per se, that the EPA is going to permit, so they're working with the Army Corps to get a permit from the Army Corps. They've gone through public comment period. Army Corps has received comments and now is proceeding with their normal process. This is an example of a mussel longline. It's referred to oftentimes as the New Zealand style growing system. This is not novel or new. These are used all over New Zealand, Canada, Britain, and other places around the world that have been employing these types of gears for decades. It would be rather new for us in the United States. But I do want to point out also that 240 horizontal long lines is what they're proposing to be commercial scale at an acreage of around 3,800 acres. footprint. So if you put that in, again, a lot of you have worked with offshore wind lease areas recently, and you understand the magnitude of those. This is a postage stamp size compared to those wind lease areas, which are thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres in aggregate. You can produce a lot of seafood in a really small footprint through some of these tested methods globally. Like I say, this has been done, and they've been doing this in other parts of the world. This proposal, 240 horizontal long lines, would roughly produce, at full build-out, a third of the blue mussels consumed in the U.S. currently, so that volume. So they could replace or add to the consumption of seafood in that kind of capacity from one commercial project. So this can happen in our federal waters in a couple ways. It can happen through a proponent like Newport Mussels, which I just shared with you, coming and saying, we want to do this. Please help us figure out how to try to permit this. Alternatively, NOAA Fisheries has responded to that executive order from 2020 and developed something called aquaculture opportunity areas. At that time, or soon after that time, we put out a request for information on here's what we're planning on doing to assess the suitability or the possibility of doing aquaculture in certain areas. Who's interested? And with that response, we went to, let me see here. We went to Gulf of America, Southern California, and Alaska thus far. Jess, you're going to throw something at me if I'm going over time, right? Somebody? Okay. So we've completed that process for the Gulf of America and for Southern California. We are in process producing an aquaculture opportunity area for Alaska. And I'm going to back up now and show you what that looks like. So before aquaculture opportunity areas, the agency was working on trying to provide support tools for natural resource management communities and those proponents to how do we assess what might be a suitable area versus a less suitable area. There really is no non-conflict, or there's a conflict everywhere in the ocean, pretty much. So how do we help advise where's there going to be where's a less conflicted area? So basically we developed these modeling tools, this is largely through our National Ocean Service, stacking up layers in a GIS, overlaying them with a grid, running the model out, and your outputs are more suitable versus less suitable. You can see in that center graphic kind of the red linear features. Those are submarine cables, right, which pop out as not a good area for this particular project, whatever it was. So you do wind up with those types of things, like don't go here areas from this model. You also end up with suggestions of, okay, this seems to be less conflicted. But again, model outputs are only as good as the information you're putting in. And we don't have all the information that you need as natural resource managers in the form to go into these models. So these models are just starting points. They're desktop exercises to give you starting point information to then begin the conversations with natural resource agencies and communities. But that has helped us then step into this request under the executive order to do aquaculture opportunity areas, in which you can see there's lots of data layers, and I really wanted to mention the fact that when we've done this in the couple regions we've done it, it's not just putting information in a model and looking at the outputs, but it's having, as you see there, hundreds of stakeholder meetings, documented hundreds of stakeholder meetings in the regions to find out what data do we not have as inputs yet, how can we get better data, look at the draft outputs and refine those based on stakeholder input. So it very much has been an iterative process in these regions. Also, I want to point out the first two were done in federal waters, so there was no assessment done in the state waters. The third one, Alaska specifically asked us to come there and do it in state waters. So NOAA Fisheries is looking at this as we only want to undertake these exercises in places where there's an invitation and there's partner agencies locally in the region to assist. So I really wanted to spend a lot of time on those AOAs because it's likely that there will be a next request for information where we would again seek input from communities. Who would want to see this done? Who would want these resources come to your community to see about going through this type of exercise? Again, this is not a zoning exercise. It doesn't create any regulatory entities. It's simply a planning exercise that you wind up with maps of places in the ocean that then can be used by the natural resource community, the regulatory community, or the proponents to suggest any future aquaculture in the waters of interest. And then wrapping up, I just want to mention one other thing that's an opportunity. We are standing up a cooperative institute fostering aquaculture research and marketing, acronym CFARM. That points to something we heard earlier about where funding is waxing and waning. And here, this is funding that for a few years now, Congress has directly increased NOAA's budget to say, go do this. So it's an example of where Congress also is supporting aquaculture production. I think largely because of that story I started out with, right, where we have a national seafood deficit. So this is an example where Congress has said, go forth and do this. We put out an RFP, programs responded. Very soon there will be an announcement of who the winning entities are to partner with NOAA in this cooperative institute, and that, like I say, it looks like it has stable funding for years to come. And with that, I will end.
Taky, you are up.
Thank you so much, everyone. In two situations, talking is very challenging. When people are hungry and when people are sleepy. After a good lunch, I myself is very sleepy, but I hope our talk, especially from the Kevin, he covers a lot about the aquaculture, what's the condition, but mine is very too specific about the recreational shellfishing. Before going into the presentation, let's, is it yours? Yeah. So I want you to better look into the slides. The sea is a desert of waves, a wilderness of water. From this wilderness, people have their livelihood, not only the livelihood, but also get their recreations done. And the fun part about the recreation is that it creates some value. It's some meaningful dollar amount that contributes to the country's economy, and it matters a lot. And my presentation will mostly focus on the recreational shellfishing in Delaware, participation, effort, and its economic value, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Delaware. So this is a very initial stage of our work. We have launched a shellfishing survey in the states of Delaware, and are mostly focusing on the clams and the crabs at this point. So let's just, Kevin has given a lot of perspective, and I might gonna very quickly skip this. Two things put in perspective: shellfishing is important in aquaculture, but sometimes we miss the part where recreation comes in. People do that for recreation, to go outside of the family, to have some quality time out there, but it creates a meaningful value, and it creates a meaningful value into the economy. And if you look for the literature for the shellfishing valuation in the United States or even in North America, broader North America, you can find very little literature over there. So it's not being that done so far. It requires our attention to do the recreational shellfishing valuation, though our work is in Delaware, but it comes with the frontier that it needs to be done for all of the coastal states. So our survey, just titled 2025 Delaware Recreational Fishing License Fishing Survey. So we actually got the license, all the any people who had the fin license from the DNREC, and we actually took the email to send out the survey, and we used the online Qualtrics platform to launch the survey and get the people's respondent. We launched the survey in late March, and we haven't done wrapping up the survey closely. We are still to send out the non-respondent survey and getting some quality check. So all the numbers I'll be showing next to them, all of my slides, don't take those as a reference number, because we'll be doing 2 of the academic paper after we are done with the survey, and then the numbers will be, looks good then. So our, this survey was mostly about clams and crabs. A little portion about the lobsterings, but we haven't got that kind of significant data to report about the lobsters. So we actually screened all of the people at the beginning of the survey. We asked about their lifetimes, fishing experiences, including saltwater, freshwater. Then we screened the people who actually went for the shell fishing by asking about their shell fishing experience in the last 5 years. Also, in the next question, we asked about their participation in the shell fishing, clamming, and crabbing in the 2025. So a detailed survey, mostly we can focus on the participation, how many days they went for clamming or crabbing, how much they capped the crabs and clams, and which are the mostly likely location they went for their shell fishing in the last year. Also, a significant portion of the survey asked the details about their last trip about their shell fishing, try to get their expenditures for their trip, to know about their timing to reach over there, and to ask about some of their questions like if they're assigned with a new additional cost, if they want to go for the clamming and crabbing, they would take the trip or not. We'll come to this point at a later part of the presentation. So, numbers. These are the very initial numbers we have got, but pretty much will be the same story we'll be getting from the beginning of the survey to the end of the survey, thanks to the central limit theorem in the economics. So, the people who went for the clamming and crabbing are mostly the elderly people. And most of them are male, and almost more than 60% are from the state of Delaware. We got a good portion of the people from Pennsylvania as well, around 8 to 7% from Maryland. So, and also a good chunk of the people hold actually college degree or more than college degree. So the people who went for shell fishing are older people, have a good range of median income, around close to more than 100,000. So this is a good finding from this survey. We asked people why you went for clamming or crabbing. The top 3, whether you went for clamming or crabbing for food or for being outdoor, having a good quality time, or you went there for being with your friends and family, the responses are almost similar for the people who went for clamming and crabbing. So clamming, shell fishing, especially the clamming and crabbing, is mostly recreational for the people who is doing that from Delaware. We asked the people what are the current condition of the clamming and crabbing, and for both the crabbers and the clammers, and they said that the condition is pretty much good, around 40 to 50%. And we also asked in the next question, have you seen what are the trends of the overall condition? Is it declining or is it improving? And most the clammers and the crabbers reported that almost half of the clammers and crabbers, the quality of the condition of the clamming and crabbing is somewhat declining. So here comes the regulation and restriction. Whenever we do design any of the survey, and we are very much like how to put the restriction and the limitation questions in form. Like people don't like the regulation and restriction. They want to catch more. They want to go every day, every night, everywhere, even possible every time. But the good thing is that people, all the regulations, we just split the questions by the size, harvest limitation, seasons, equipment type, and for the location restriction. But people are getting this limitation and restriction in a very good way. So they are actually acknowledging the fact that this restriction and the limitation were put in forth to make sure the sustainable harvesting of the clamming and crabbing. So we also wanted to come up with the aggregate number for Delaware clams and crabs. It turns out that there are more people who actually went for crabbing rather than clamming, and around more than 650,000 days have been logged for crabber. Still, don't take this number because there are a lot of responses coming in, so we are just in middle of the survey. And almost around very close to 5 million crabs have been harvested in Delaware in 2025. And the numbers for the clams are a bit on the lower bound comparing to the crabs, like the number of days, number of million crabs, and how many clams or crabs they generally catch in their typical day. And these are the type of crabs and the size of clams. We asked them what they generally harvest, and people, so NOAA are very happy to see almost 85% of the people are catching the Jimmy, the male mature one, and the same thing from the clam. So people actually don't know this type of crabs by this name, Jimmy, Sook, Salis. So what we did, before they answering to the question, we gave them a guideline, which Jimmy means, which Sooks means. So they're pretty much understandable what their names are, and they're easily responded correctly to the answers. And also this crab specific, which are the most methods they actually use to catch crabs, like it was expected to get the crab traps to be on the top, as well the crab pots. Also, we also asked the people which is the location or the access point you use most for your trips to the crabs, and it turns out that people, almost close to 70% of the people actually used boat to went for their crabbing in Delaware in 2025. This is very interesting. We have given the respondent a set of a total of 24 shellfishing sites. It turns out that almost 80% of the people, for the crabbers it was 70%, and for the clamming it was close to 80% of the people mostly go to one site for their shellfishing. So people have always have their favorite places to go, and they have some interest to go over there over and over. Either they like the place or they get the most from this place. So this is interesting. And these are all of the zones. We asked them about where they actually, so we actually did two things. First, the people who actually didn't respond to the detailed zones, because this is a very long survey, we asked them about their broad zones. So Delaware Bay and Tidal Tributary and Delaware River, for example, is a broad zones. If they are interested, they then pinpoint their location where they went, like for zone 1 or zone 2 or zone 3. Then we asked about their number of days they went there and number of harvest they kept. So these are the zones we provided them with. And also, while we are looking at the data coming from the zones, it turns out that Indian River Bay is the most common, most interesting place happening for clamming and crabbing, and almost 40% of the days logged for crabbing people went there, and for the clamming it's close to 60%. So if the authority, DNREC, has to put something very much important for enhancing the clamming and crabbing, and that's if that should be zone specific, they should really focus on these two zones at least first. Now the last thing I'll be talking about, we also is trying to value the recreational clamming and crabbing. So these are our plans for the two of the papers forthcoming to do the parametric estimation and also do the non-parametric estimation. This is the results from the non-parametric estimation. Also, the value you see is on the upper bound. We also have the lower bound where the crabbing is around $70 per trip. For the clamming, it's around $60 per trip. So how we actually calculated that? We asked the respondent, would you still have taken the trip provided that if the cost is some dollar amount more? The dollar amount varies from $5 to $15, $25, $50, $75, $150, up to $300. And some people actually responded, no, I want to be taking, I don't be interested to expend more for clamming and crabbing. At the end of the thing, we actually get a very simple demand curve. So demand curve actually gives us the quote unquote like the term consumer surplus. So in a plain language summary, the value tells us how much the recreational clamming or crabbing is important for the respondent or for the resident of the Delaware. And I'm right on the time, maybe 30 seconds left. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taky. And now we have Ellen.
All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Ellen Rowe, and I work as a GIS analyst at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science with Roger Mann and Melissa Southworth. And I am so honored to be here and excited to be sharing with you all my work visualizing decades of change in Chesapeake Bay oysters using GIS. I'm going to move us a little bit away from the economic side of things and give a case study in Virginia. And I loved what Avalon said right before lunch of this theme of how do we make data not only accessible but also easily understandable and digestible for a wider audience, and that's really the theme of what I'm talking to you today. So to start, I'm sure we're all fairly familiar that oysters are incredibly important. As we've heard, the shellfish industry is incredibly important as a valuable economic driver. It also holds important cultural significance to the Chesapeake Bay area. And they also play a very vital ecological role. So oysters are filter feeders, they help clean the water, and they also build reefs that help provide habitat for other species. So to give you a little bit of context about oysters in Virginia, this graph here shows landings of oysters over the past 150 or so years. And you can see that there's this dramatic decline from about the 1900s hitting this all-time low in the 1980s, 1990s. And so this was due to overfishing as well as the outbreaks of two diseases, dermo and MSX, and that's noted on the graph there. And so this led to a need for research to help support and inform management decisions, which in turn has led to a recent small improvement in the past 20 or so years that you can see outlined in that red box there. So taking a look at some of the research that started to help better inform management, the Patentong Survey was started in 1993. It's a collaboration between the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, VMRC, and VIMS. And so every fall they go out and collect oysters in the public fishing grounds of Virginia, and so this provides that fishery-independent data that is really helpful in making management decisions. But this leads to a bit of an issue. What do we do with all of this data? They have decades of data that is vital in informing management decisions, yet it's only as helpful as we can display it in ways that are informative to those people making those decisions. So that's where my project came in. I was tasked with taking all of this data and utilizing GIS to visualize temporal and spatial trends to produce a user-friendly, engaging, and accessible product. So GIS, if you're unfamiliar, stands for Geographic Information Systems, and GIS software allows us to visualize complex spatial data. So I use two main software types. ArcGIS Pro is where I did my data processing. I'm going to touch briefly on how I used Model Builder and how important that's been in automating yearly updates. And then the bulk of the work is in ArcGIS Online in a site through Experience Builder, which this is a little snapshot of the site, which is how we're creating that engaging visualization. So first, I'm going to touch on Model Builder. So Model Builder essentially lets you string together various geoprocessing tools. And so this let me work through all of that backlog of data. Analyzing almost 30 years of data would have taken a long time to do each step manually. And so this helps speed that up and make sure I did the same thing for every year of data. But then additionally, the really nice thing about this is I was able to turn those models into tools to update data every year. So this is an ongoing survey, and so I created this user guide that helps walk someone through how to update this data, even if they have a limited GIS background. And so to give you a frame of reference, our last day in the field this year was January 8th, which is a little later than normal. We had some weather issues, but the data was updated by January 23rd, and that was in time for one of the management meetings. And so this really speeds up the time it takes for us to get data to the people who need it. And of course, the main limitation was you do have to manually fix errors. So now I want to spend the bulk of my time giving you a demonstration on our site. Some of you I've already had the chance to show at the Tools Cafe and really appreciated getting to talk to you. But if this is your first time seeing it, this is the VOSARA website. VOSARA stands for Virginia Oyster Stock Assessment and Replenishment Archive. And it is a user-friendly, interactive website, again, built through Experience Builder, which lets you really customize these sites without requiring a lot of coding. So the first thing you do when you enter the site is you can select a location. We're going to zoom into the Rappahannock River. And now I just want to orient us to what we're looking at on the screen. So we're looking at the Rappahannock River. Those larger polygons, which are mostly yellow in this screenshot, those are going to be management areas. So VMRC breaks up different river systems into areas to help manage, open or close different areas. And then the smaller polygons there are going to be our oyster reefs. And so every year when we do this survey, we take different sample points within those oyster reefs. The color you're seeing represents an average of all the sample points within each reef. And so right now the variable we're looking at is something called brown shell. Which I'm now going to explain. So brown shell is the amount of oyster shell that is above the mud. And so that means it is available for spat, which are baby oysters, to come and settle on the reef. And so we need a lot of brown shell to have a healthy oyster reef. And so you're going to see we have this same color scale for all of the variables that we measure, with red being not very much, that's bad, green meaning there's a lot of it, that's good. So our hope is that that's very easy to interpret. So then the main feature of the website is this time slider at the bottom that lets users quickly display and watch decades of data. And so you can see through the colors, quickly visualize the trend in brown shell in the Rappahannock. And so you can see we started very yellow, very orange, and as we run through the time slider, we get a lot more green. So just from that little snapshot, hopefully you all have a sense that brown shell in the Rappahannock is increasing. So now I want to highlight that the user can actually switch between variables using the tool to the left. So the variables we have available include all of the things we measure on that Patent Tong survey. So that's going to be the number of oysters in 3 different size classes, including market-sized oysters, so oysters that are big enough to be harvested, spat, which is again those baby oysters, and then kind of our in-between size. And then as I mentioned, that brown shell volume. We also have a layer of estimated biomass, as well as disease prevalence for both MSX and dermo on select reefs. So then a user can also turn on and off different spatial layers using that tool. And so I'll give you a quick rundown of the spatial layers we have available. We have the averages on a reef level, a management area level, as well as a river level, the boundaries for all of the polygons, and then we also have some layers that give a little bit of management information. So we have this repletion layer that tells us if VMRC has added shell, which is a very common practice. That's going to be symbolized by that up arrow. Sometimes they actually take shell from one reef and move it to another, so you might see a down arrow, or even they might have done both on one reef. And then we also can look at the harvest status. So on both a reef and management area basis, VMRC might close an area for harvest, and so that's going to be shown by that crosshatch. And if it's open, there's going to be no crosshatching. So we can add some of these layers together and watch the same time slider progression. This is showing the average number of market oysters, and you can see in how the crosshatching is rotating. VMRC does this strategy called a rotational management strategy, where they close an area for 2 years, they do some repletion, and then they open it. And this helps spread out effort over the river and allows areas that have been fished to catch up in the off years. And so you can see over time, we went from very red to getting a lot greener. And so this visualizes a very successful management strategy in the Rappahannock. We actually had a PhD student from the lab last year publish this paper where she looked statistically at how impactful and successful this strategy has been. But again, this site visualizes that in a way that's hopefully really intuitive. I also want to highlight that this is the reason it's Vocera 2.0 is because we had a original Vocera site, which I'll play that video again. You can see you would just click on an oyster reef. We had a static summary and then these graphs that you would look through. So we wanted to make our updated version have the same functionality but be improved. So if you click on a reef, it pulls up these graphs, and these graphs are dynamically created. You can look at all the different variables. The colors match the map. You still have that longer narrative if you really want more information. And something I really want to highlight about this is it's easy to update. So before, my boss had to individually make all of those graphs and upload it to the site. So that takes a long time. As soon as we've run the data through those models, the graphs are updated. So finally, I'm going to just breeze on through some of the extra features. We have this compare maps tool that actually lets you look at two variables at the same time. We have a fairly extensive about section that gives a lot of background information and goes in depth on the methods. We have a tutorial and help section to try to make it as user-friendly as possible. And we also have a feature that's will be available soon where users can actually download this data as CSV files. And so as I'm wrapping up, I want to highlight that we are hoping this is useful for a wide range of audiences. The primary audience, like I've mentioned, we worked really closely with the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and they have a Shellfish Management Advisory Committee, and so we're hoping that this can be useful to them in helping aid their decisions regarding opening or closing those areas, as well as replenishment. But looking further out, we also think this could be really helpful for shellfish marketing to be able to show that the Virginia oyster fishery is sustainable, as well as the scientific community. That data downloads feature, estimated biomass graphs, all the heavy data features is more geared towards maybe a scientific audience. And then finally, we're hoping this can be a tool for the general public. We worked with some of the people at VIM's education department to put together a high school lesson plan to get high schoolers interacting with this data. So I'm super excited about that. And so now, as I'm wrapping up, I want to hit on the importance of this website. So as I've mentioned, it displays a lot of data in an engaging and interactive way. Our hope is that it will allow policymakers and industry members to visualize trends quickly. to help facilitate discussion between scientists and policymakers. And also, we believe this methodology could be used for other long-term data sets. So next steps, the site launched publicly this past March after we went through some rounds of feedback. I'm continuing to improve the site features, and we're also developing a version for VMRC that's just for them and has some extra data. Feel free to check out the link and QR code. It's right there. I want to say a huge thank you to Roger Mann and Melissa Southworth in the Mollusk and Ecology Lab at VIMS, as well as Andrew Button and everyone at VMRC. This work was partially funded by VMRC's Commercial Fishing Advisory Board, and also Shannon White in the Center for Geospatial Analysis at William & Mary, as well as many others. Here's just a quick summary. Thanks so much for listening. My email is there. Feel free to reach out with any questions, and I'll be here the rest of the afternoon if you want to chat.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And Daphne.
Excellent. Ellen did that work as an undergrad, everybody. Seriously. Really amazing. Jealous of that tool. I'm really glad for the invitation to be here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is shellfish, fisheries, aquaculture, seafood opportunities. They're delicious. Please eat more seafood. And I'm going to start off today, I'm going to kind of reiterate some of the things we've been hearing from the other speakers, but this is an exercise I do with my undergraduates when I'm teaching, so I'm going to get professorial here. I want everybody to think a little bit about commercial fisheries in your state. Imagine just what comes to mind. I say commercial fisheries, dock, what species is it? What do you picture when you think about commercial fishing, right? And my students, usually it's things like flounder or tuna or things like that. Here's the situation in New Jersey. I apologize, I'm from New Jersey, so this is what I'm going to focus on. But what I'm showing you are, these are pie graphs of the top 10 species that are coming across the dock commercially in New Jersey. They're colored by invertebrates in the orange colors and fish in the purple colors. We've got weight on the left, so it's about 50-50 invertebrates versus fish coming across the dock, although Menhaden, bunker, if you're from New Jersey, is the big one. But when you look at the breakdown of value, over 3/4 of the value coming across the dock commercially in New Jersey are invertebrate fisheries. We can call them shellfish. We can argue later about whether squid are shellfish or not. I call them shellfish. They are mollusks, after all. But this is really, the students are often really surprised by this, right? New Jersey is the seafood state, and I'll argue that it's actually the shellfish state. These are a few of the fisheries fisheries and aquaculture industries I work closely with in the state. This isn't all I do, but I'm putting this up there just to, again, emphasize the economic importance of these critters. So the oyster wild fishery in Delaware Bay is just under about $5 million coming across the dock every year. Oyster aquaculture in the state is a little more valuable than that. Farm gate just under about $7 million a year. And then surf clams is another group that I work with closely. In terms of the fishery dollars across the dock, for surf clams, we're talking closer to just under $20 million a year. These are big deal economically, right? They're also local seafood. So to what Kevin's point about imported seafood, these are locally grown, locally harvested seafood. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on some of the work we've been doing with surf clams. So I'll give a little background on the critter. The Atlantic surf clam is a big clam. They grow to a very, very large body size. They have dispersive planktonic larvae, so they're they're moving around in the ocean as babies, and then they settle to the bottom and grow. They live about 35 years on average. The oldest ones we've seen are on order of 40 years, but they become reproductive at about 2 years old. So they have an incredible fecundity. They're really, really fecund. They're harvested using a hydraulic dredge. These are large boats, big dredges that operate on the continental shelf. I'm showing a habitat map there. It's a high-value fishery. It's also MSC certified, sustainable fishery. These are some of the products that you might be familiar with. If you've had clam chowder, you've probably had a surf clam. If you've had canned clams that are in the grocery store, you've probably had surf clams, chopped clams, that is. The fishery has a few challenges. Some of those are climate related, ocean acidification, temperature. There's also been more recently some concerns with interactions with the offshore development of offshore wind, the potential for this fishery to get displaced from those areas once construction's complete is a real concern. And so I'll come back to these challenges in a minute, because at first I want to talk about where I started with some of this work, and this goes back 12 years. It's scary to me that I've been at this that long. But one of the reasons I wanted to start here is we've been working for, like I said, about 12 years on developing this as a new aquaculture candidate. So what's interesting here is it doesn't necessarily, as an aquaculture species, compete with the fishery product, because the fishery's catching big, old, large clams from the wild, but the aquaculture potential for this is to produce an animal in less than a year that's a small clam, that's a completely different product. And what was really exciting about this work for me when we started it was the fishermen who came to me and said, can we do this? And they weren't doing it because they're trying to get out of fishing. They're trying to diversify their operations into aquaculture to add that onto their business portfolio, okay? And in fact, it was a processor who we really got the conversation going. And to Kevin's point about importing seafood from other places, this particular clam processor for their baby whole clam product in a can was importing clams from a Southeast Asian fishery that they know is unsustainable, that they know is poorly has management issues. They wanted a domestic product that could replace that in their cannery, in their product line, but it doesn't exist yet. We don't produce on farms at that scale. Kevin talked about the mussel farm, right? 1/3 of the entire national mussel consumption. We're talking about a lot of clams have to come to that cannery in one production cycle to fit their needs. And so that's where we started with surf clams. I said to them, well, surf clams could probably do it, but we need to do some work. And they said, well, what do you need to do that? And they actually provided me seed money, pun intended, 12 years ago to produce baby surf clams so I could start playing with them in the hatchery and out on farms and handing them, literally taking bags of these clams to farmers and saying, see if you can do something with this. And that's part of how development's got to happen. And I think Kevin also made a really good point about the fact that we don't necessarily need to stick with the few species in terms of shellfish that are being farmed now, but we should be looking for diversification opportunities. And so that's what we did with this work over the past decade or so. But what was really exciting more recently is in talking with this processor, in order to get to the scale they needed, right, the volumes they needed to be coming into their canning plant, we really need to go offshore. And so that was what this particular project was about. We were lucky enough to produce a bunch of clams and go out and try to grow them in the ocean off the coast of New Jersey. We were in federal waters, Kevin knows this. We were not permitted as a farm, we were permitted as a research activity. But what happened there in our second deployment that went out in the spring, we put out 2 cages in 2024. We left those cages out for 3 months. And those clams turned into a very viable product. And so very fast growth rates, really great conditions. To Kevin's also point about the mussel farm being tiny footprint for what we were producing as well. And you can see our fishing partner there helping us put a cage overboard. What's exciting there again is this diversification opportunity for the fishing companies. So to do this out in the ocean, you can't be doing it in a Carolina skiff, the way that farms are operating in back bays. You need to be doing it on ocean-ready vessels. You need to have the docks, you need to have the infrastructure. And so some of those partnerships have been really exciting. I'll go back now to some of those challenges that I spoke about earlier with the surf clam fishery. One of those is potential interactions with offshore wind. We did some work to look at what the scale of impacts would be if that fishery was displaced from offshore wind areas that were slated to be built out. And the impacts are substantial. 3 to 15% of their revenues would be lost if they had to move out of those areas and fish elsewhere. And so that set up another really interesting conversation is, okay, what can we do to help mitigate that, right? And so we thought about enhancement. And so this is another thing that Kevin alluded to is, what about putting these things out in the ocean, put and take fishery type opportunities? It's not quite aquaculture. It's more like ranching. So it's a version, right? It's supporting a fishery through stock and through enhancement of areas outside of wind lease areas. This work was largely done by partners at VIMS who are super, and we estimated the scale that you have to get to meet this lost opportunity, and it's substantial. And we don't have all the answers yet, but we're continuing to work on that to ask questions about what the scale is, what are the details involved, how do you get there, how do you fund it, who has access, who decides where the seed goes. There's lots still to unpack. But I'll come back to this point that I think you really need a community-based approach. You need to be working together with the stakeholders who are out there in the ocean, the fishermen who are already out there, the wind lease developers who are working out there, and the management agencies. I'll switch over now to talk a little bit about some of those environmental, climate-driven impacts that I mentioned earlier as well. We know that temperature is a big one for surf clams, like many species in the ocean. Warming ocean temperatures are a problem. We also think that shellfish are impacted by ocean acidification. I'll say that that way on purpose, because I think it's something that a lot of people point to, but I don't know that we have good data on that yet. This is work that was done by Laura Steves, who is a postdoc in my group, did some excellent experiments. We were using flow-through raw seawater, so naturally fluctuating temperatures and pH conditions, and then we applied an offset onto that. We heated up the water to see how they responded. We added CO2 to see how they responded. And the take home from this was there was really no clear ocean acidification effects from these experiments. And again, we were doing these in raw water. This is not the way these experiments are typically done. So we were allowing the clams to have as much food as they wanted. Turns out when they have food, they can kind of handle a lot of stressors that might otherwise be problematic. But we did see that they could get stressed by OA under conditions where the temperature was high. So again, temperature seemed to be the big stick for surf clams. And so that kind of put us down a pathway, again, supporting this idea about diversification and what kinds of animals could be farmed. How do we create a climate-ready species as we're thinking about diversification, right? So this was work that was done by Dr. Mike Aquafrida. He was a graduate student at the time in my group. And we basically did some selective breeding tests. We put some clams through a temperature stress and killed 70% of them, took the survivors of that temperature stress, and it turns out they actually handle temperature better, but even better than that, their babies also handle high temperatures better. So we think this temperature tolerance trait is very heritable in this species. And we've continued to work on that. Another really exciting thing that we've been thinking a lot about lately, there's two subspecies of surf clams. So there's the surf clam that we fish off New Jersey, those big dollar values coming across the dock. There's also what we call a southern subspecies. It turns out now that we're looking for it, we're finding it in a lot of places, not just down south. But one species doesn't live quite as long, but it handles warm temperature better. It lives in shallower, warmer water. So these two subspecies have different characteristics, a little bit of different growth rates. We wanted to explore whether we could cross these in the lab and produce a hybrid that had both high growth and temperature tolerance in the same animal. And I won't have time to go into all the details from these results. This is stuff that's very new in our group. We've been working on this for the past 3 years or so. It turns out the hybrids do exhibit hybrid vigor, and we've produced probably 4 or 5 different groups from different parents, different hybrid groups. And every time we test them, they turn out to be resilient to warmer temperature, and they perform better as larvae, as young juveniles, under high temperature stress than either of the purebreds do. So we're really excited about that as another opportunity for kind of selective breeding. And these are things that are done commonly with shellfish aquaculture already. Selective breeding is the foundation of why oysters are doing well on farms today in the U.S. So this isn't unusual. We're not making Frankenfish here. We're doing this all very naturally. I think it's a really, really exciting opportunity, again, that supports this diversification opportunity. I will wrap a little bit early, but again, point to the fact that these are highly collaborative efforts, and I wouldn't be standing here talking to you guys about this today if it wasn't for the fishing companies who were really forward-thinking about opportunities to diversify their business portfolios. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you to all of you. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you to all of you. That was really fascinating. It's really cool to see how, these small changes and long-term monitoring can impact the fishery, which then impacts the economy, and, creating these linkages and sharing those linkages in a way that people can understand, such as Vosara, is really important, and I love to see it. So we now have time for some audience questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and I think we have
one
some
right here.
over here. Okay.
So this is probably for the whole panel, is the question, with the offshore aquaculture sites, how is NOAA taking a look at helping our tidewater communities, our small, local commercial fishermen, being able to adapt to that offshore kind of model, since these nearshore areas are getting kind of farmed out? And how do we prevent it from becoming just a monopoly of large corporations owning that space, so that they don't get, kind of pushed out of that market?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, because they're somewhat different sectors. You need to have deep pockets and a strong spine to try to do this offshore. As I think maybe somebody mentioned, maybe it was Daphne mentioned, you need to have purpose-built vessels. So you can't just take the same farm operators that are working near shore and kind of have them expand their operation to include something out in federal waters, because you need purpose-built vessels. You do need different crews that are trained for the offshore environment. So they're kind of two different sectors. I don't know that there will be a lot of interest for near-shore farm operators to go large commercial scale offshore. That's the way I see it, but I don't know. So in my job, I have talked to a lot of proponents. Some of them are international entities, CEOs from other countries who are interested in doing this type of thing in the United States. I have not had any local farmers who have come with more than initial conversations, and then once they understand the cost and the magnitude of the permitting, they don't pursue it. So I think it's two different sectors, looking inshore and offshore.
I'll offer a thought on it, and I think, because it's true, it's just a completely different game offshore. It's completely different risk environment. Not that there's no risk for inshore aquaculturists, right? But I think, the U.S. is way behind in farming the ocean, in particular offshore farming. There's plenty to look at internationally and what's gone on in other places. And one of the examples I can think of off the top of my head, France and Japan in particular have done a nice job in supporting kind of community ranching for scallops. And so there could be ways to do that where it's like if you had a group of Tidewater folks who all came together to create a cooperative and then collectively have some strategy to, come together under a banner like that. But yeah, it's very expensive, very risky, and it's a different game, right? You have to go to a much bigger scale to get offshore and make it viable. Yeah.
And I'll just follow up too. So we do, I don't want to neglect to mention, we do interact with a lot of fishermen that are currently fishing that then are interested in diversifying their operations or maneuvering into aquaculture. Sometimes it's the younger generation of the fishing family that wants to do aquaculture. But they're 99% of the time they're talking to us about doing it in state waters. So they're not looking to go offshore. Like I say, the few times they've talked about going offshore, once they understand the magnitude of what it takes, they start looking back in state waters.
I'll also say that there's going to have to be, depending on what's going on offshore, there'd have to be onshore support. And so my example about the stock enhancement for surf clams, it's a monstrous amount of hatchery capacity that needs to support that. And that would be, there'd be a skill crossover there for some of the smaller scale inshore aquaculturists, that if they wanted to be the hatchery supplier for some of those bigger operations, that, there could be opportunities like that as well.
I have one more question here.
Great. Go ahead.
This one may be for Kevin. I just was really struck by, we have this discussion a lot about sort of the import market here in the U.S., but how much of that change to that dynamic needs to be more targeted development of U.S. consumers beyond just shrimp, salmon, and canned tuna? I mean, could you speak to that in the new seafood office, or are there thoughts about developing the demand more beyond those top three?
Yeah, there's definitely much in the way of discussion and planning. Maybe I shouldn't say planning, coordination among that topic of market development. I didn't really touch on it, but the last slide I briefly put up there, I talked about some of our recent developments within NOAA fisheries on the economic side of things. Like we've been hiring some economists to work on our aquaculture opportunity areas to do more economic analysis. So we definitely see that as a piece of understanding the current analysis, impacts of putting in these operations, and especially regionally, but also market development. And a lot of the market development discussions when I say I hear about that, is coming from universities that are doing some of that work, NGOs. So there is definitely the interest, and yes, it's needed, because we consume much less in the way of shellfish and diversified shellfish and seaweeds than like Asian countries where so much seafood consumption is happening.
Thank you, panelists. Any other questions?
Actually, while Dave's thinking of that one, I'll go ahead. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, previous question about support or opportunity for existing aquaculturists, fishermen in state waters. As Daphne alluded to, we see seafood production. We need to support seafood production across all the sectors in all the different ways. There's room for that in the United States. There's no reason that anyone needs to give for another sector to have place because of our large EEZ and our market demand. But so adding to the nearshore production with, say, offshore production, it can support those local communities in the ways of the processing facilities, the canning facilities, all those things can not only, they could grow, but even if they don't grow, they could be stabilized, right? We hear so much about concern for working waterfronts being able to continue. So at least stabilizing them with more production would be of value to those local working waterfront communities that may not be jobs, harvesting, but they may be processing and all the support jobs along the coast.
Thanks. Dave.
Yeah, a question for Daphne. You mentioned how much selective breeding goes into surf clams, trying to get them heat tolerant. And you showed how quickly they can grow during those summer months under ideal conditions. I'm curious, do you have to monkey with the ploidy levels like the way we do in oysters to get that quick grow without them, shunting off energy for reproduction?
We haven't done anything with ploidy at this point. They just grow fast. If they've got food and they've got the right water conditions, they'll get up to what you'd call a little neck size or something that would go on a pasta plate in 8 months, and that's just without anything for selective breeding for growth. The stuff we've been doing with the heat tolerance is kind of different. It was basically just asking whether they can handle. At the time, we were really doing a lot of work with hard clam farmers. We were giving these clams to hard clam farmers and saying, see what you can do with it. And of course, those habitats get really warm in the summer. And so that was our pinch point then, and that's what we were looking at. But when we moved out to the coastal ocean, the water out there is cool enough that we're not dealing with heat stress there. But yeah, we're not looking at ploidy level at all yet in any of that. And I don't think you would necessarily need to, because they're just starting to get into reproductive stage by the time they're big enough. Yeah.
Okay, this is great timing because our session has concluded and it looks like nobody else has some burning questions. So we're going to go ahead and pass it on to Avalon. You going to come introduce the next session or? Break. Sorry. I'm trying to not have you guys break. Sorry. Have a break. Enjoy it. Thank you for being here.